picture this. You're strolling down Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv, right? Sun's shining, startups everywhere, people sipping cappuccinos.
Sounds about right.
Could you imagine 100 years ago, this was all swamp? Like, seriously, swamps.
It's wild, isn't it? The sheer scale of transformation that's happened in such a short time. To get our heads around it, we got to talk about Aliyah, these waves of Jewish immigration that brought people in, brought skills, brought this insane ambition to make something out of nothing.
Okay, so zoom in on that for us. We're talking early 1900s, right? What would make someone pack up their life and head to, well, basically a massive construction site?
Think about it. These weren't just regular immigrants, right? They were often escaping some really bad situations, fleeing persecution, yearning for this homeland they'd barely known, and they were willing to face down some seriously harsh conditions to build it. It's almost like
the OG startup founders.
Exactly. That same drive, that idealism, believing they could just will a better future into being. It sends chills down my spine.
Yeah, except their venture capital was like grit, determination, and probably a whole lot of bug spray.
You got it. And speaking of startups, those early farming communities, the Moshavat, they hit some serious bumps in the road. Aiming for equality, sharing resources, often meant they struggled financially.
Which is where the kibbutz and moshav models come in, right? Learning from those early struggle.
You nailed it. They realized, alongside the ideals, you need things to actually work. The kibbutz, communal living, everything shared, that was one answer. But the moshav, that was different. Families owning their land, running their own farms, but still cooperating with neighbors, like an early co-op. Yeah, not just about farming, though, was it? Different ways of living, different ways to organize a society right there at the ground level.
And all this is happening while, let's just say, the political situation's evolving, too. Jewish national funds buying up land, the Jezreel Valley especially, which, let's be real, wasn't exactly prime real estate back then.
Oh, this is where it gets interesting. We're talking serious swampland here, right? The local Arab peasants, they saw it as basically useless. They didn't have the resources, the know-how to do much with it. Then come these Jewish immigrants, backed by groups like the JNF, and boom, they drain the swamps, turn it into farmable land. It's a wild transformation.
It sounds like a win-win, so where's the catch?
Imagine you're one of those peasants. You've known this land your whole life, right? Suddenly it's thriving, but it's not yours anymore. Breeds resentment, displacement, reminds you who holds the power, yeah? Progress for some can come at a cost for others. It's a tough thing to swallow.
Yeah. No easy answers there, that's for sure. It really underlines how important it is to see things from different sides, to really grasp the whole picture. But before we get into those different viewpoints, there's another big player about to make an entrance, the British Empire. So the Ottomans are out, the British are in, inheriting a place that honestly some sources describe as practically medieval. You're talking about a culture clash, right? Like what was going through their heads when they first got there.
Can you imagine stepping off the boat, probably expecting, I don't know, something out of Arabian Nights maybe? And instead you've got a population where electricity is this newfangled thing, sanitation's basically non-existent. It's like stepping back in time, a completely different world.
It's mind-boggling to think about. But weren't the British famous for their infrastructure projects? Did they even try to bring things up to speed?
Oh, absolutely. Roads, ports, railway, stuff we take for granted now, but back then, totally revolutionary for the region. Look at Haifa, for instance. Under the Ottomans, it was nothing special. The British, they saw the potential, turned it into a major port. Suddenly, you've got this connection to global trade, the seeds of an industrial powerhouse being planted. It's pretty impressive when you think about it.
That's a perfect example of how infrastructure changes everything. But what about the human side of things? How did the local Arab population feel about all these changes? Was it all sunshine and roses?
That's where things get a bit more complicated. Yeah, some folks appreciated the improvements, better living standards, access to education, healthcare. But for others, it felt like cultural imposition, you know? The British brought their own systems, their own ideas about how things should be run, and that didn't always sit well with existing traditions and ways of life.
It's that age-old tension, right? The intention might be good, modernize, help people out, but it could easily be perceived as a threat, a loss of control.
Exactly. And that's where this whole idea of historical resentment comes into play. The British, despite their efforts, were often seen as occupiers. Their very presence just added fuel to the fire, exacerbating existing tensions and even creating new ones. It goes to show, even with good intentions, you can really mess things up if you don't understand the local context, the nuances of the situation.
Which brings us to this idea of recurring patterns in history, right? We keep hearing about this cycle of violence, this yearning for honor in the Middle East. How does this period under the British Mandate feed into that larger narrative?
Okay, so we're getting into some pretty deep and sensitive territory here. But if we want to understand the present, we've got to grapple with these things. What we see during the British Mandate is this magnification of existing power imbalances. The local population already dealing with the influx of Jewish immigrants, now they've got another dominant power calling the shots. It created this breeding ground for resentment, this yearning for agency, for a way to reclaim their sense of honor and control.
So are we saying that the British, even while trying to bring stability, inadvertently laid the groundwork for the conflicts to come?
It's not about assigning blame, right? It's about understanding the long-term consequences of actions, even those taken with the best of intentions. The British Mandate, it sought to create stability, but it also exacerbated existing tensions, failed to address the root causes of conflict. And that has had a lasting impact on the region.
Makes you wonder, could things have gone differently? But I guess that's a whole other conversation.
A whole other deep dive, maybe.
For now, let's shift gears a bit, move from those turbulent times to the present day. I'm curious, how did those architectural choices back then, that blend of Ottoman and European styles, how did that influence what we see in places like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem today? It's amazing to think about how those buildings, those houses, they still shape how cities like Tel Aviv or Jerusalem look and feel even now.
Right. It's like this cultural fusion baked right into the landscape. Like picture Tel Aviv, right? You've got those Bauhaus buildings, super European, super modern. And right alongside, you've got that older Middle Eastern style, a whole conversation happening just in the architecture about the different forces that shaped the place.
And Jerusalem too, right? Ancient next to brand new. It's incredible.
Exactly. And it's not just looks, though, is it? It reflects something deeper. Think about those early immigrants coming from Europe. They brought their ideas about building with them, but they weren't just copying, were they? They had to adapt to the climate here, the materials, the whole way of life.
Just like those pioneers we talked about, figuring out the land, making it work.
Exactly. That resourcefulness, it's a common thread, isn't it? Draining swamps, building a tech sector, it's wild. And speaking of tech, it's amazing how those early infrastructure projects, the ones the British did, kind of laid the foundation for everything that came after.
From those little settlements to, well, everything we see now. It's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder, could that same spirit, that drive to innovate, to adapt, could it be the answer to some of the problems the region faces now?
$1 million question right there. History doesn't hand out easy solutions, but it gives you perspective. I think if we've learned anything from all this, it's that change, massive change, it is possible.
Makes me think what you said earlier about historical resentment, the need for honor.
Yeah, those are deep-rooted issues, right? Not just about economics or politics, but about how people feel. Empathy, understanding, being willing to see things from the other side, that's essential.
Not easy, that's for sure. But knowing the past seems like a good place to start.
Absolutely. You can't fix what you don't understand, right? By looking back, learning from those who came before, maybe we can make better choices, build a future that's a bit more peaceful, a bit more just.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into Israel's transformation. From swamps to startups, we've covered a lot of ground. The early immigration, the British Mandate, even how architecture tells a story.
It's been a fascinating journey exploring all these different layers with you. And for those listening, don't stop here. Keep digging, keep asking questions, keep making those connections.
And speaking of connections, if today's deep dive piqued your interest, you have to check out the Liat Show, My Journey to Infinity. It's a Substack, right?
Substack, yeah, I've heard of it. Haven't really had the chance to dive in yet, though.
It's this platform where writers like Liat share their work directly with readers, like a blog, but a bit more polished, you know. And Liat, she goes deep on history, culture, all sorts of mind-blowing connections, just like what we talked about today. You can subscribe for free, get her latest insights right in your inbox.
Sounds right up my alley. Always up for a good deep dive, especially one with a fresh perspective.
You won't be disappointed. The way she writes, it's like bringing history to life. Oh, and she's not just on Substack. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, even Patreon. Talk about a storyteller for the digital age.
Wow, she's everywhere. Definitely adding her to my list.
Please do. And for our listeners, same goes for you. You can find all the links in our show notes. That's it for us this time. But until next time, keep exploring, keep those minds engaged, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.